They fed a nation through poverty, war, and dust, but somewhere along the way, these humble meals were buried with the people who needed them most. What did we lose when we stopped eating like we were trying to survive? Potato peel soup was not a luxury. It was the end of the line for scraps that had already done their duty. In the worst years of the Great Depression, families were faced with hard choices, none harder than whether a meal was even going to happen. But even then, nothing went to waste. Potato skins, onion ends, carrot tops, bacon grease, water, salt, that was dinner. Some called it broth, others called it survival. The soup pot sat on the back of the stove all day, constantly fed with whatever the family could spare. It smelled like resolve. Nobody made a big deal out of it. No fancy name, no cookbook glory. It just showed up when the cupboards were bare. People say hunger is humbling, but this kind of soup made you feel something more complicated, pride and shame at the same time. You learned to appreciate the smallest scraps, the smallest moments of sustenance. Today, we throw away more food in a week than these families had in a month. The soup is gone now, and so is the patience that made it. The world has moved on, but that quiet wisdom of making do remains forgotten. What would it take to make something from nothing again? Water pie sounds like a joke, but during the leanest years, when cream pies were a distant memory and even powdered milk was rationed, this dessert was real. You had water, you had sugar, you had a bit of flour. That was enough. You poured it into a bare crust and baked it like hope itself. Somehow, the flour thickened it. The sugar caramelized just enough. What came out wasn't pretty. It jiggled. It was clear. It barely held its shape. But it was sweet. And that was more than enough to make it feel like luxury. Kids lit up when it hit the table. It meant their parents had tried. It meant dessert was not entirely gone from their world. Water pie never made it to the cookbooks that survived. It was too embarrassing, too revealing. But if you ask someone who remembers the 1940s, they might tell you about it with a strange kind of smile. There is beauty in what we make when nothing else is left. And maybe shame in how easily we forgot. Because water pie was never just food. It was defiance. It was dessert with nothing. It was sweetness wrung out of desperation, and that made it unforgettable. Liver pudding was the brick on the breakfast plate. Dense, brown, glorious in its own greasy way. Not pudding like we think of it, more like a meatloaf with history. Pork liver, cornmeal, onions, spices, molded into a loaf, chilled, sliced, and fried in a pan until the edges went crisp and the middle softened. In the South, it was the working man's fuel. It showed up next to eggs, grits, or biscuits. The flavor was deep, earthy, bold, and more than a little divisive. But to the people who grew up with it, it was the taste of home, the taste of what you could afford. For a long time, butcher shops made it fresh. No labels, no mass production. It was made from what was left after the better cuts were gone, and nothing got wasted. Then came supermarkets, clean aisles, shrink wrap. Suddenly, liver pudding looked a little too honest. It was forgotten, even mocked. But once, it was breakfast for thousands who had no time to be picky. Could we stomach it again today? Or are we too far gone? Egg coffee was not just a drink, it was a trick, a habit, a Scandinavian secret whispered through the generations. Immigrant communities in the upper Midwest brought it with them, and it stayed for decades in Lutheran kitchens and logging camps. The idea was simple, but strange. Take your ground coffee, mix it with a raw egg, shell and all. Dump it into boiling water. The egg would bind the grounds, pull them down, and leave you with a brew that was smooth, clear, and strong. It stretched the beans. It tasted clean. It looked like tea, but smelled like Sunday morning. No filters, no fancy tools, just a pot and some patience. In households where everything had to serve a purpose, even breakfast had its ritual. Egg coffee warmed hands and hearts and kept people moving. It was never about luxury. It was about getting through, about making the most of what you had. But slowly, it disappeared. replaced by drip machines, instant powders, and drive-through windows. The old trick was too slow, too odd, too forgotten. The world moved on, yet a little something was lost in the rush. How did the most practical cup of coffee vanish in a world that claims to love nostalgia? Dandelion greens with fatback did not come from a garden. They came from the ditch, the field, the yard that had not been mowed in weeks. These greens were not planted. They were picked, wild, bitter, full of life. Appalachia had a long memory for these kinds of foods, the kind you did not buy, the kind you just knew. Springtime meant dandelions. You picked them young before they got tough. You washed them twice. Then came the fatback, a chunk of cured pork that melted down into something golden. That hot fat was poured over the greens like dressing. Maybe a little vinegar, maybe not. It was not a salad. It was a wake-up call after a long winter. The bitterness reminded you that life was still hard, but the salt and fat reminded you that it was still worth living. The simplicity of it all was its beauty. No recipes, no expensive ingredients, just what the land had to offer. It filled your belly and grounded you. It was a meal that told the truth about hunger, about survival. Today, we spend $10 on foraged greens in fancy restaurants, but these dishes used to come free with the land. Cornmeal. Mush was both punishment and comfort, depending on how it was served. On the stove, it was a thick, steaming porridge, plain as it gets. Eaten hot, it stuck to your ribs. Eaten cold, it was something else entirely. Families would chill the leftover mush in a pan until it set like a cake. Then they sliced it, fried it in lard. The edges crisped, the middle softened, and suddenly the texture transformed. Breakfast was ready, or maybe dinner. Mush was the kind of meal that did not care what time it was. It only cared that you were hungry. It came cheap. It stretched far. It required nothing fancy. Add a little syrup, a little butter, and it became almost elegant. But it faded, too plain, too poor, too real. These days, cornmeal mush is a ghost of its former self, barely remembered, rarely made. But ask anyone who grew up eating it, and they will tell you, it was enough. Maybe more than enough. Why did we stop trusting simplicity? Hog maw is a name that makes people flinch. But to some families, it meant celebration. It meant tradition. It meant that nothing went to waste. In the Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens where it thrived, hog maw was a dish of resourcefulness. Pig stomach stuffed with seasoned potatoes and sausage, baked until crisp, sliced like a roast. The outer casing turned golden and chewy. It was a decadent, savory dish that a lot of the natives of the area prided themselves on. Back then, gluttonous pork feasts were a major thing. Now, that might not sound too thrilling, but wait till you hear about how the flavors unravel with this one. The inside was warm and spiced and rich with fat. It was a holiday dish, believe it or not. It took hours. It took effort. But it also took what others threw away and turned it into a centerpiece. Hog maw spoke a language of no apologies. It said, "This is what we have, and we are going to make it special." Over time, though, that pride curdled into embarrassment. The stomach was seen as too primitive, the stuffing was too greasy, and the old ways got left behind. But who decided what was too old to keep? Tomato gravy over biscuits came out when the meat ran out. And in a lot of Southern homes, that happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. This was the next best thing. You took flour and oil or bacon grease, stir it till it browns. Then you would add canned tomatoes. Let it simmer, and suddenly you had something that looked like Sunday dinner, even if it was only Tuesday to spare. You'd avoid a Wednesday crisis too, because this was a really economical meal to make during tough times, especially when you had to stretch your pantry until it was on its last legs. For how modest it seems, it packed quite a flavorful punch. Ladled over hot biscuits, it soaked into the crumb, turning starch into something satisfying. It was tangy, fatty, hot, and deeply Southern. Kids grew up on it. Parents quietly prayed they would not have to serve it again. Tomato gravy meant you were doing your best with what was left. It was not glamorous, it was not even pretty, but it filled a plate and kept the family fed. Today, you can barely find a mention of it, a few food blogs here and there. But the memory is fading fast. How many of these quiet victories have we erased from our kitchens? Milk toast was the gentlest food imaginable, warm, soft, and barely there. It was for sick days, for sad days, for the days when nothing else would do. You took slices of bread, usually stale, toasted them, then poured over warm milk, often with a dab of butter and a pinch of sugar. The bread swelled, then sagged. The milk pooled around it like a blanket. It was bland by today's standards, but it was not meant to impress. It was meant to comfort. And it did. Grandparents swore by it. Mothers made it at midnight. It was the culinary equivalent of a lullaby. Slowly, though, milk toast became a punchline, a shorthand for weakness. Too soft, too old, too plain. But maybe that says more about us than it does about the dish. When did we start mocking the foods that healed us? Slippery dumplings were not delicate. They were not dainty. They were stubborn sheets of flour and water rolled thin, sliced wide, and dropped into boiling broth until they turned slick and silky. In parts of Delaware and Maryland, they were the heart of Sunday dinner. Not puffy like other dumplings. These were flat, slippery, substantial. They clung to chicken and soaked up every bit of flavor. A bowl of slippery dumplings meant family was near. It meant someone had been working the dough with their hands. It meant somebody still believed in cooking slowly. But time wore down the ritual. Mixes came in boxes. Restaurants offered faster things. And slippery dumplings, like so many old foods, began to vanish. They were too much effort, too old-fashioned, too humble, but they were never just food, they were memories. How many of our memories have gone out with the dishwater? Souse, also called head cheese, was not cheese and definitely not something you would find in a deli today without someone making a face. But back then, it was pride on a plate. You took the parts nobody wanted, the head, the feet, the ears, boiled them down until everything tendered up and the collagen turned into natural jelly. You chopped the meat fine, spiced it with vinegar, salt, and pepper, and let it set in a loaf pan. Cold, gelatinous, served in slices on crackers or bread. It sounds like a dare now, but this was normal. This was food, the kind of food that spoke to respect for the animal, for the work, for the hunger that came after hard days. It was sharp, chewy, and real. You did not pretend it was anything else, and it held up on a hot day, in a lunchbox, or at the factory break table. But somewhere along the line, Souse got labeled too graphic, too poor, too weird. It vanished quietly, the way most honest foods do. How did we go from making the most of every piece to pretending those pieces never existed? Mock apple pie, or Ritz pie, was built on a lie that tasted too good to argue with. In the 1930s and 1940s, apples could be expensive, hard to find, or simply out of season, but people still wanted dessert, something warm, cinnamon-kissed, and nostalgic. Enter the cracker, saltines, crumbled and layered in a pie crust, soaked in sugar syrup and lemon juice, topped with butter and cinnamon. You baked it until the illusion was perfect. The crackers softened, the flavor transformed, and you had yourself a slice of apple pie, without a single apple in it. Some folks never knew the difference. Others knew and loved it anyway, because it was a trick that worked, and that was enough. This pie was resilience served with whipped cream, and during war or depression, it gave families something to look forward to. Today, it sounds like a gimmick, the kind of thing someone posts online for laughs. But back then, it was joy disguised as dessert. How many of our traditions were built on clever illusions we chose to believe in? Corn cob jelly turned kitchen waste into gold. Normally, you'd probably think this was some crazy fusion experiment from the 60s, but it was actually an underdog of from even before that. You'd be surprised about the kind of innovative little recipes you can find tucked in the corners of American culinary history. In homes where every part of the harvest mattered, you did not throw away corn cobs. You boiled them, long and slow, until the water turned sweet and golden and carried the ghost of corn flavor. Then you added sugar and pectin, and just like that, jelly. Sunshine in a jar. It was clear and golden and tasted faintly of warm summer fields. It spread easy over biscuits, gave flavor to toast, and made something out of nothing. The cob, after all, was the part nobody talked about. It did its job, then disappeared. But somebody, somewhere, looked at that and thought, we can use this. And they did. For decades. It was not trendy. It was not sold in stores. But it filled pantries and made breakfast feel like an event. Corn cob jelly was a testament to not giving up, not giving in. Today, we compost or toss without blinking. But once, we made magic out of the discarded. Why did we stop believing there was treasure in the trash? Vinegar pie was what happened when lemons were too much to ask for. In hard times, you could not just run to the store and grab citrus. You had pantry staples and you had creativity. Sugar, flour, butter, eggs, and vinegar. A splash was all it took to make your tongue believe it was biting into lemon. The filling baked into something tangy and rich, nestled in a flaky crust. No zest, no fruit, just illusion and ingenuity. It was sharp, sweet, and satisfying. This was not a poor version of something better. It was its own thing, and people grew to crave it. In the rural South and the Midwest, vinegar pie earned its place on the table. Grandmothers passed it down. Not because it was fancy, but because it worked. It hit the spot when nothing else would. These days, you say vinegar pie, and people squint, unsure if you are joking. But the joke's on us for letting go of a dessert that proved flavor never depended on wealth. When did we forget that taste could come from sacrifice? Boiled peanut soup was born out of abundance and struggle. In the South, peanuts were everywhere. Boiled peanuts were a roadside staple. But soup? That was the farmer's spin. You boiled the peanuts soft, shelled them, blended them with broth, onion, and a bit of fat. What you got was something creamy, earthy, and deeply Southern. A warm bowl of what the land gave you. Peanut soup was protein without the price tag. A full meal, built from the ground up. It stuck with you. Kids slurped it up without asking what was in it. Adults knew and were thankful. It was a dish you could make with what you had. A meal that brought families together without requiring a trip to the store. Today, we barely recognize it outside a handful of low-country cookbooks. It was too humble, too quiet, too practical. But for years, it meant survival, nourishment, resourcefulness. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't on trend. But it was real. And real has always been the most powerful ingredient. How many meals did we abandon just because they reminded us of where we came from? How many generations of wisdom born from necessity have we lost in favor of convenience? The true cost of progress is often measured in the things we forget. Johnny Marzetti was not a person most folks knew, but the dish bearing his name fed thousands. Born in an Ohio restaurant, it was ground beef, macaroni, tomato sauce, maybe a bit of cheese, baked into a casserole and scooped onto plates like it was currency. School cafeterias ran on it. Church potlucks relied on it. At some point, every kid in the Midwest had eaten Johnny Marzetti without even realizing it had a name. It was cheap, hearty, and required almost no fuss. You could stretch it for days. It got better the second time around, and it made a house smell like somebody was trying. It was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But it fed people well, and that used to matter most. Now it feels like a relic, replaced by freezer meals and drive-through dinners. But the casserole dish still remembers. Do we? Was it really about the food, or was it about the time and care it took to make something so simple feel like home? It's hard to say when we let convenience take over, but when was the last time something you ate really made you feel like someone cared? Hog and hominy was a bowl full of contradictions. Native roots, southern soul, and frontier practicality all stirred together. You took pork scraps, usually from smoked or salted cuts, and simmered them slow. You added hominy, corn kernels treated with lye, puffed up and chewy. It all came together in a pot of fat, broth, and memory. It was savory, salty, and filling, perfect for feeding big families with small means. The name alone sounded like a song, hog and hominy, stick to your ribs kind of food. It came from days when flavor came from time, not packaging. You cooked it low, you shared it wide. It was one of those meals where you did not need seconds, but you took them anyway. Somewhere along the line, it dropped off the map. Too rustic, too heavy, too real. But for generations, it was the taste of making do and making it count. What else have we lost by chasing convenience? Chitlins, or chitterlings, were not made for squeamish people. They were pig intestines, cleaned, boiled, and fried until crisp on the outside and tender inside. They smelled intense, but the flavor was deep, rich, and unforgettable. In the rural South, especially among African American families, chitlins were survival food. They were also celebration food, made during holidays, gatherings, or hog-killing season. They required patience and courage and vinegar. The cleaning process alone was enough to scare most people off. But for those who grew up with them, chitlins were sacred. They represented the power of making something dignified from what others threw away. A plate of chitlins was more than food. It was resistance. Today, most people will not touch them. The stigma stuck, even after the hunger was gone. But behind every pot of chitlins was a story about grit, family, and pride. Are we afraid of the food or the truth it carries? Cold pancake sandwiches were the brown bag answer to no time and no leftovers. You took what you had, yesterday's pancakes, maybe cold and rubbery, slathered on peanut butter, molasses, maybe a smear of lard or jam. Folded it, packed it. That was lunch. Sweet, dense, a little odd, but satisfying. The kind of sandwich that stuck to the roof of your mouth and got you through an afternoon of school or field work. Kids knew it. They did not question it. It was what Mom made. It was fuel. No crusts to cut off, no fancy fillings, just pancakes, the poor man's bread. And in a time when every meal was a minor miracle, that was enough. Today, we want bento boxes and energy bars. But a cold pancake sandwich had heart. It said, "You are going to make it through the day." How many of those quiet little comforts have we left behind? Beaten biscuits were nothing like the flaky ones you know today. These were hard, dense, built for travel and time. You made them with flour, salt, lard, and water. Then you beat them with a mallet, a rolling pin, even a hammer, for 30 minutes or more. The goal was to drive out every air pocket. You wanted them smooth, tough, and shelf-stable. They did not rise. They did not crumble. They survived. Wagon trains packed them. Farm hands carried them. Soldiers kept them in satchels. They were dry, yes, but when split and filled with ham or butter, they were worth every smack. This was food as function, and yet somehow it had soul. You could feel the work in every bite. Somewhere between a cracker and a biscuit lived this relic of survival. But nobody makes them anymore. Too much effort, too little payoff. Still, they tell a story with every chew. How many stories did we stop telling just because they took too long? Oleo spread with yellow dye packets was a kitchen ritual born out of restriction. Back when dairy lobbyists had real pull, margarine, or oleo, had to be sold plain white by law. Butter was golden. Oleo was not allowed to be. So companies slipped in little packets of yellow dye. You kneaded it in by hand, like working paint into dough. It stained your fingers. It was messy, but it made something fake feel a little more real. Families gathered around a bowl of margarine, pressing and folding until it looked the part. It was part science project, part rebellion. And for many, it was the only butter they knew. This chore became a symbol of doing what you had to, just to keep appearances. The dye was cheap, the effort was not. But pride? That was priceless. You fed your family with what you had and made it look beautiful. Today, margarine comes golden and perfect. No kneading, no work. But no story either. When did we decide that convenience was more important than connection? Poor man's steak, rice and gravy was imagination at its finest. You browned flour and fat, slow and careful, until it darkened into a rich roux. You added onions, stirred in broth, and poured it over rice. That was dinner. No meat, no frills, but somehow it tasted like something bigger. Because it was not just rice. It was an act of transformation. Kids believed it was steak. Grown-ups wished it was. But nobody went to bed hungry. This dish showed up at kitchen tables across the South and Midwest during the Great Depression, and long after it. It was a plate of comfort that cost almost nothing. And it stuck with you. Rice and gravy had power. It tasted like effort, like care, like somebody trying to make the best out of scraps. Today, we chase flavor with sauces that come in jars. But this was flavor born of patience. What did we lose when we stopped using our imaginations at the stove? Scrapple was where waste ended and breakfast began. In Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens, you did not throw out pork scraps. You boiled them down, minced them, and mixed them with cornmeal and spices. You poured the thick batter into loaf pans, let it chill until firm, then sliced it and fried it crisp. The outside crackled. The inside was soft, savory, and rich. Scrapple was not fancy. It was practical. It turned leftovers into something loved. You served it with eggs, applesauce, or syrup, or just ate it straight from the skillet. It had a loyal following and still does in pockets of the East Coast. But to many, it is strange, mysterious, even off-putting, because Scrapple dares to admit that good food does not need to come from prime cuts. It can rise from the overlooked, the tossed aside. That idea used to be normal. Now it feels almost taboo. Why are we ashamed of the meals that saved us? Gravy bread was survival on a slice. No meat, no sides, just bread. Soft, white, and waiting, drenched in pan drippings. Sometimes there were onions, maybe a spoonful of mashed potato on top. But often, it was just the bread and the gravy. Salt, fat, starch, and dignity. In working-class households during the Depression, this was dinner, or breakfast, or a late-night meal to quiet the stomach. You did not call it poor. You called it enough. It was what you could make when there was almost nothing left to make. And somehow it still felt warm, real, like someone cared enough to give you the last drop of flavor scraped from the skillet. Today, it sounds like a joke. But ask anyone who grew up with it, and their face softens. Gravy bread was more than filler. It was love in a time of lack. What else have we thrown away, just because it reminded us of hunger? Depression. Mac and cheese was not what you know today. No cheddar, no cream sauce, just canned milk, elbow macaroni, a handful of flour or breadcrumbs, and whatever cheese scraps you had, if any. You boiled, stirred, and baked it until it held together. The flavor came from the browning, the effort, the memory of better meals. This version of mac and cheese was gritty, honest. It did not melt the way boxed brands do now, but it filled the belly and the table. And for many kids, it was the best part of the week. Mothers made it without complaint. Kids ate it without judgment. It was never about richness. It was about resourcefulness. Today, comfort food comes from plastic trays and frozen aisles. But once upon a time, comfort was something you built, bite by bite. Why did we trade homemade hardship for empty convenience? Saltine porridge was the answer when cereal ran out and oats were too dear. You crushed crackers, not fancy ones, just plain saltines, and poured boiling water or milk over them. Stirred it, waited, ate it with sugar if you had some. Sometimes butter, sometimes nothing. It was warm, bland, but comforting. This was breakfast for the broke, for the tired, for the ones trying to stretch one more meal out of an almost empty kitchen. It had no flash, no spice, but it filled the space where hunger used to be. And that counted. Kids knew the taste. Adults pretended it was enough. But in the silence of early mornings, saltine porridge said, "We are still here, still trying, still feeding each other." These days, we skip breakfast or rush through it. But saltine porridge lingered. Why does food only feel worthy when it comes with variety and price tags? Cornbread in buttermilk was less a dish and more a memory in a glass. You took leftover cornbread, crumbled, dry, maybe a little stale, and stirred it into cold buttermilk. That was supper, or dessert, or both. It was tangy, gritty, simple, eaten with a spoon, straight from the glass or bowl. In Southern households, especially rural ones, it was tradition, the kind passed down without a recipe. Grandparents called it a treat. Kids wrinkled their noses until they tasted it. Then they understood. This was a ritual. A way to honor what was left, what had fed you before. Nothing wasted, everything remembered. Now it feels like folklore, something too odd to repeat. But for the ones who knew it, it was peace. What happens when we stop eating the foods that connected us to the people who came before? Turnip top soup was made from what most people threw away. The leafy greens, sharp, bitter, full of iron, boiled with ham hocks, salt pork, or whatever bones were lying around. Add some onion, maybe a potato if you had one. Let it simmer, long and slow. The bitterness softened, the broth darkened, and suddenly you had soup, deep, smoky, alive. It was not pretty, but it fed you, nourished you, gave you something hot to hold in winter when money was thin and work was thinner. It came from the backyards and back steps, from gardens and grocery scraps. Nothing bought, everything earned. Today, those greens are often cut off and discarded. Turnip tops are forgotten. But once they were a lifeline. Do we even see food the same way when we never have to fight for it? Grape nuts. Hot cereal was not crunchy when served this way. It was soft, warm, and surprisingly filling. You boiled water or milk, stirred in grape nuts, and let them swell. Add sugar if you could. Maybe a splash of vanilla or a slice of banana. But usually it was just grains and heat. Grape nuts, sold as a health food in the early 1900s, became a poor man's porridge during leaner times. It lasted forever in the pantry. It stretched. It sustained. Kids called it gravel cereal, but ate it anyway. It stuck to your ribs, made you feel strong. And you could pretend, just for a moment, that it was enough. Today, we treat it like an antique. But there was a time when grape nuts meant more than fiber. It meant hope. How many of our meals used to say, "You are going to make it"? Onion sandwiches were not for the faint of heart or stomach. You sliced a thick raw onion, laid it between two slices of bread, spread lard, mustard, or mayonnaise if you had it. That was it. No lettuce, no meat, just bite, burn, and bravery. For families without options, it was filling, fast, and fiercely pungent. You ate it because it worked, because it was fuel, because the onion was cheap and bread was sacred. You chewed, your eyes watered, and still, you were grateful. Some even craved it, especially with sweet tea or pickles on the side. It was a punch in the mouth and a lesson on gratitude. Today we laugh at the idea, but the people who ate onion sandwiches did not laugh. They endured, they thrived, and they remembered. What does it say about us when we refuse to taste what fed generations? Cabbage and potato mash is pretty much in the same vein of food too. Cabbages were something that people abused maliciously and for good reason. They were a plant that grew all year young, they were easy enough to grow, and if you couldn't grow them, you could buy them for dirt cheap. What's not to love here? Exactly. Now, potato mash is a no-brainer that doesn't need any explaining. Who doesn't like potatoes? I'm pretty sure potato mash is one of the chronic constants in human history. Like, everybody has had a potato phase. I think it doesn't even end. Sadly, though, this recipe did end, metaphorically speaking. You won't find people making cabbage and potato mashes anymore, but for what it was worth, this was an incredibly good meal when you added some salt and lard to it. The potatoes would gain this deeply vivid flavor that just felt like mashed potato, but so much more enhanced thanks to the lard, and the texture and sensation of the cabbage would add the perfect contrast the dish was so badly in need of. It was a great meal to come back to from a long day of work, and both the main ingredients cost virtually nothing back then. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Made in eras and locations where no part of the animal was wasted, not out of culinary curiosity but out of necessity. Sheep trotters stew is a meal that was created out of sheer resourcefulness. Simmering the sheep's trotters or foot, which are rich in bone, tendon, and gelatin, but have very little meat, over low heat until their stiff sections break down into rich, silky collagen, produced a broth that was more like a potion than a soup. It was savory, sticky, and intensely animal. It was not a delicate outcome. It was gamey, fatty, and primal, with a mouthfeel halfway between a thick, glossy sauce and a hearty stew. The taste of barn smoke and bone marrow lingered on the tongue. Shepherding and subsistence farming families were most likely to prepare this type of food, particularly in remote and hilly areas where sheep were raised for their meat as well as their wool and milk. From the early 1900s through the 1940s, it made its way into the kitchens of Appalachian Hill communities, some areas of Utah with a strong sheep-herding culture, and among Greek, Middle Eastern, and Eastern European immigrants in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. Designed to keep you warm from the inside out and repurpose what the butcher would have thrown away or sold for cheap, it was winter food, sustenance for hard workers. When the Great Depression left families scrambling for affordable meals, one dish became a staple in relief kitchens and struggling households. Hoover stew wasn't about fine dining. It was about making whatever was available stretch as far as possible. Named after President Herbert Hoover, who took much of the blame for the economic collapse, this dish was a mix of government-rationed ingredients and whatever scraps were on hand. The base was cheap, elbow macaroni boiled until soft, mixed with canned tomatoes, beans, and the occasional slice of hot dog. If a family was lucky, they might have added a few extra vegetables, but more often than not, this stew was about using what little they had. There was no set recipe. Some households made it thinner, stretching the broth to serve more people. Others loaded it up with starch to make it more filling. It was often served in soup kitchens, where large pots of it kept desperate families from going hungry. Hoover stew was a reminder of tough times, of stretching every dollar, and of meals that weren't glamorous but got the job done. And in a strange way, it became proof that even in hardship, people found ways to make something out of nothing. Brown bean soup is an honest, unpretentious dish that you can just leave to simmer on a stovetop. It's a bowl full of the best when money is tight. You need to be a bit patient, though, and also a bit skilled in the kitchen. This is made with dried brown beans, and they're often pinto beans, but they could be kidney, cranberry, or local beans as well. The soup was really popular throughout the Depression, and you would see it in all sorts of kitchens, rural communities, and throughout many homes and restaurants in the South and Midwest. I think its biggest heyday was definitely in the 30s, stretching to the 50s. As far as the flavor goes, it's actually just a bit sweet from the beans, and it gets smokier if you add a ham hock or bacon rind to it. It's definitely a flavor that runs deep, though. The soup was a working-class old reliable, especially in states like Kentucky and Tennessee where dried beans were really cheap. Their ability to feed an entire crowd the way they do is probably what made them stand out as much as they did. Back to the Appalachian region, and this time the Piedmont region as well, a sonker is one of the highlights of Northern Carolina cuisine. It's often served warm with like a generous scoop of ice cream, but it's actually a fruit dessert. These are really popular up in the South, you know? They get very serious about their fruit desserts. It's hard to find out where the dish first originated from, but lots of people believe that farming families that were trying to make the best out of their fruits are the first ones who found it. Actually, a lot of people seem to unanimously agree that it first popped up in Surry County. This is also where it's most well known, so maybe this one has a bit of truth to it. The city of Mount Airy in Surrey County is also known for its massive use of Sonkers and how it really doesn't ever let up on them. People there make these throughout the year, around the clock, and it's a point of competition for local bakeries too. Surrey County even has Sonker Day, which is an annual event that celebrates the dessert. It's this community thing in Pilot Mountain, and people from around the place come and make their best version of a Sonker, along with lots of other regional foods that have tons of history. The Sonker contest is one of the best things to check out in the area, so if you're ever around, give it a visit. Bran porridge is like millet gruel. It was a food that was born entirely out of necessity and not an indulgence. It was made from wheat or oat bran. The outer layer was milled off during flour production, and this actually helped so that every part of the grain was utilized. It was pretty economical if you think about it. Luckily, bran porridge wasn't as bad as millet gruel. This had a gritty, fibrous texture and a nutty flavor that needed a lot of sweetening to work though. It wasn't really good, or good at all actually, but it could be made into something palatable if you worked with it. Bran porridge was something that was pretty much fed to livestock, but bran found its way into our diets during lean years like the 30s and 40s when flour was as expensive as meat. In poor farming households from Iowa to Georgia, bran porridge was a bit of a regional classic. Adding some molasses or sorghum syrup in there was a game changer. Still, this was a dish that people forced themselves to eat too. It stuck to your teeth, and you couldn't leave it for too long because it would begin to boil like cement. Once white flour and boxed cereal came around, people forgot about this entirely. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Chicory coffee is a really bitter adaptation of your regular old cup of joe. It's something that's born entirely from scarcity, but it was carried forward by, well, simply being good. This is a coffee that's made from the root of the chicory plant. Chicory plants were only a bit less common than dandelions, but they required a lot more work. You had to dig the whole thing up, scrub it clean, chop it, roast it, and ground it. This was used to blend in precious coffee beans so that they would last longer, or it was used as an outright substitute. This is definitely different from your regular coffee though. Intensely bitter, nutty, woody, and smoky, it has no caffeine, but it has plenty of character. If regular coffee is something you think is a punch in the face, then chicory coffee is death by 1,000 cuts. It saw a really big surge in popularity throughout the Civil War, especially if you went to Louisiana. This is where Union blockades were most common back then, and they actually made coffee imports next to impossible, but the people had to scratch the psychological itch one way or the other. Quinoa is really something we've gotten used to, haven't we? But it didn't always used to be that way. Quinoa was actually a staple crop of the indigenous Andean farmers way back in the day. It's cool the way things end up traveling half the globe before they end up in our bowls and on our plates, huh? But it got to us by the time the Spanish got here, and while they weren't really too fond of quinoa, all the small indigenous farming communities did still keep planting it. Even throughout the 1900s, it was mostly seen as a poor man's crop and wasn't looked upon too favorably. This was its luck for much of the remainder and the next century, until in the 1990s, as research into different kinds of food developed, it became known that quinoa was actually very rich in protein. It also helped that it wasn't a grain, but it could be used like one. A best of both worlds situation, really. Ever since then, vegetarians, healthy food bloggers, and gym bros have unitedly pushed for how much more of this we need in our diets. I think it's taken off, since it's now considered a pretty luxury health product. It's even a lot pricier now. Ariana Grande isn't the only one who loves dandelions. Turns out, our grandparents were die-hard fans too, especially when it was dandelion green salad, and this dish could essentially work miracles if you ever heard about it from somebody who was alive back then. See, the thing about dandelions is that they were so insanely abundant that it was criminal to not take advantage of them. They were on roadsides, sidewalks, beaten paths, off-trail roads, gardens, fields and meadows, and just about literally anywhere, really. You couldn't even call it foraging because you just had to step out of your house for like a minute, and bam! Dandelions. But the best part was using the leafy greens and stems to make a nutritious salad, which was actually insanely beneficial too. One of the best things people do with dandelion salad is they use it to boost their immune system, thus keeping them less sick. And remember, if you're poor, you really need to not be sick. Funny how that works, right? There was a time when a sandwich didn't mean deli meats or fancy spreads. It meant whatever you had on hand, sometimes just 2 slices of bread and a few desperate ingredients. That's how onion and ketchup sandwiches became a meal. During the Great Depression, fresh vegetables were scarce, but onions were cheap and stored well. Ketchup, often considered a condiment today, was one of the few affordable ways to add a little flavor to otherwise bland meals. Put them together between slices of bread, and it became a poor man's sandwich, sweet, tangy, and just sharp enough to remind you it wasn't quite a meal, but it would do. There was ingenuity behind this simple combination. Ketchup, made mostly of tomatoes and vinegar, gave a touch of acidity and sweetness, while onions provided a crunch and some much-needed bite. For many, this wasn't just a makeshift meal, it was a way to stretch ingredients when grocery money had run dry. Some families added salt and pepper for extra taste, while others toasted the bread to make it feel more substantial. For those who ate them, onion and ketchup sandwiches were a symbol of making do, of finding a way to put something between 2 slices of bread when times were at their hardest. Millet gruel was this really thin, slightly sweet and bland porridge that pretty much just served as a big staple for rural poor people, especially in different parts of the American South. Gruel isn't a dish that people look forward to. That's the case now, and it was the case back then. It was something you treated more like medicine, and most of the time it was eaten when you were in need of medicine too, but couldn't afford a doctor's visit. That's kind of what I meant by poor people not having the room to get sick, because if they do, they can't really go for treatment or even over-the-counter remedies. Instead, what people would do is try local ones like this. Gruel was something fed to babies, convalescents, the elderly, and people with digestion issues, which, trust me, were common enough. Something you'd see in boarding schools, farmhouses, and tenant farms. This was a meal that was humble, frugal, and sustaining, but also a deep reminder of poverty and living from meal to meal. Johnny Marzetti is a dish, not a person, and it's one that's entirely tied to the history of food in Ohio. While people debate the exact circumstances that led to this dish, there's no doubt that it was named after the real-life Johnny Marzetti, who was a restaurant owner up in Columbus, Ohio. His entire family owned what was known as the Marzetti Italian restaurant during the early years of the 20th century, and the most commonly accepted origin story is that this dish actually began here. It was something so popular that people started to associate the Marzetti name with it, and it was their best-selling pasta. What people don't know for sure is whether the dish was something that just caught a catchy name or whether it was Johnny Marzetti's magnum opus. All we do know is that around the 1950s and 60s, you started hearing this name a lot more commonly. In the Midwest regions, it was known for being on school lunch menus and for its ability to feed an entire busy family with almost no effort. Barley and onion porridge is essentially the go-to of Depression-era survival food. This isn't something that came about as a result of the Depression, though. This has been a recipe that people have kept locked and loaded, aimed at the jaw of tough times for centuries. Barley in and of itself is one of the most influential grains we've ever had. Like, this has to be making a top 5 list of all time somewhere. Onions, on the other hand, were added to pretty much anything to help produce more flavor. Back then, onions were seen as a smart 2-minute kitchen hack if you wanted to really add some flavor to your dish and fast. So what people would do is slice it up, Cook it with the barley so the onions kind of softened and turned to mush, or they would throw in caramelized onions in there. Some people just put slices of raw onion, which never really made sense to me because that doesn't feel like it would work with porridge, but hey. Barley and onion porridge was one of those recipes that stood shoulder to shoulder with any kind of oatmeal bowl, and even though it's not a grain we use too much anymore, it definitely was a top contender. This soup was one of the best things to start your day with too, and trust me, back then, people needed all the energy they could muster. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? White bread, rye bread, brown bread, and cornbread. We've had a whole charcuterie board of different kinds of breads, but what we never talk about is acorn flour bread. This quiet, overlooked piece of American food history has a lot to offer for the keen eye that catches its name in a dusty old cookbook from 70-something years ago. It has an incredibly distinct flavor that gives you a bread experience you've probably never had before. The flavor here is distinctly woodsy, and it's also kind of sweet. Not a lot, but just enough. The best parts are the tannins and the strong, nutty flavor that breaks through with every bite. The texture is a bit crumbly and dense, but the magic is definitely in the crust. Bake that right, and you can get a caramel-tasting crust for free. This kind of bread had its heyday throughout the Great Depression, especially throughout wooded regions in Northern California and the Appalachia, where dense stretches of oak trees were a common sight. Definitely a survivalist favorite. Sheep's head stew was often enjoyed in rural areas where nothing went to waste. Skinning the head and preparing it for the stew is a time-consuming task, and it can get messier, but if you manage to pull this one off, it is definitely worth getting your hands dirtier than usual. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took eat your skincare to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Love it or hate it. Grated raw potato pancakes might be a familiar name to our Jewish audience, or better known by their actual name, potato latkes. In Jewish tradition, these were one of those dishes that were passed down through generations. In old American farm kitchens, it was a dish that seemed pretty plain, but actually had a lot to bring to the table. Both quality and quality wins. The flavor here is extremely savory, and it almost has this meaty decadence that's totally unique to the dish. The grated raw potatoes are slightly caramelized to give them a brilliantly crispy edge, and they just taste like the purest possible version of a potato. When you season it with just a little bit of salt and pepper, you get an even better ride. But personally, I like the recipes that used grated onions and garlic more. That just sounds like a party. The pancake is different from any kind of pancake we've ever known. These were a poor man's luxury, hot, crispy, and satisfying on cold mornings or when there was no meat. You'd see them a lot in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio, where a lot of Eastern European immigrants had come to settle. It's a dish that I think we could bring back, though. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Pickled turnips, a burst of sour crunch that previously sat in root cellars and mason jars across immigrant kitchens and rural pantries alike, are the bright, sharp punctuation mark in an otherwise weighty meal. Firm white turnips were sliced, and for that distinctive magenta hue, a sliver of beetroot was frequently included. The veggies were then packed in a vinegar brine with salt, garlic, and occasionally spicy pepper or other spices. Bold and unrepentant, the flavor is salty, tangy, and peppery, leaving a lasting impression on the tongue and cutting through fat like a blade. In the early 1900s, they were particularly prevalent in immigrant households from the Middle East and Eastern Europe, especially in urban areas of Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan, where pickling at home was a survival tactic as well as a cultural institution. Although pickled turnips were less popular than pickled cucumbers or okra in Appalachia and the rural South, they did appear in years when turnip crops were abundant and preservation was of the utmost importance. Turnips were inexpensive, hardy, and quick to grow, making them the perfect nourishment for low-income households to last through the long winter months. Pickled turnips are the perfect addition to your diet if what you're looking for is a sustainable vegan recipe to cure all your ails. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. A sour, vegetal holdover from a time when wild greens were collected with the same seriousness as planted crops are stewed sorrel leaves. Particularly in the South, Appalachia, and among Eastern European immigrants, sorrel, a leafy green with a lemony tang, was harvested from springtime fields and fence rows by people who knew exactly what to do with a plant that others may mistake for a weed. A vibrant, almost citrusy flavor that falls halfway between spinach and rhubarb, with a faint metallic edge from its oxalic acid, emerges when sorrel is cooked down and melts into a soft, silky tangle. In the early 1900s, stewed greens were an essential component of the diet, particularly in low-income rural homes. Stewed greens were an essential component of the diet in the early 20th century, particularly in low-income rural communities. Sorrel was essential during the slender hunger gap before summer gardens arrived, since it was inexpensive, nutrient-dense, and one of the first greens to appear after winter. In Kentucky, West Virginia, and eastern Tennessee, families would frequently prepare it simply, stewing it in bacon or lard drippings, maybe with onions, and serving it with biscuits, beans, or cornmeal mush. In immigrant communities in Chicago or Cleveland, sorrel may be boiled down with cream and potatoes and served alongside dumplings or black bread. Imagine biting into something so hard that it could double as a building material. That was hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. It wasn't exactly a culinary delight, but it was a lifesaver for soldiers and sailors on long campaigns. Its secret was longevity. Properly stored, hardtack could last for years and, in some cases, even decades. But eating it wasn't for the faint of heart or teeth. Soldiers often joked it was hard enough to stop a bullet. To make it edible, many soaked it in water, coffee, or stew to soften it. Without that, breaking it might feel like a test of willpower. Salted and cured to withstand long journeys, dried fish added essential nutrients, though the smell wasn't exactly subtle. Imagine a ship full of men and barrels of dried fish during a humid summer. Let's just say it's a good thing Fabrese wasn't invented yet. These simple foods fueled explorers, sailors, and armies through grueling months without fresh supplies. Though unassuming, they were engineering marvels of preservation and utility, proof that survival often came at the cost of flavor. If any of these forgotten meals stirred a memory, tell us in the comments. Feed the like button and subscribe so these stories never get thrown away again.